Welcome everyone. So today I'm going to be talking about a little known or completely not known at all strategy that I like to call learning by failure. Now, you don't have to be an Einstein to know that the word failure has a lot of negative connotations in it, which is kind of why I really like this strategy and why I think it's an important one to just have in your toolbox of tools, your teaching repertoire. Whether you're teaching little kids or high school or adults, it's always important to bear in mind how you deal with failure and how you go about reframing failure as being something positive, because it's just part of that process. So that sort of reframing is an important part of that learning by failure strategy. Now, the reason I like to call this a strategy, or why I guess coined that term in a sense, is because anything that we do in schools that's important, that's considered best practice, I like to turn it into a strategy so that we can study it and so we can think about it and we can come up with the positives, the negatives, what works, what doesn't work, so on and so forth. So the first, and not only that, but what are the types of rules around it, or what are the ways in which we can integrate it into our daily teaching practices? So failure is obviously a part of learning anything new. It's a part of education. It's an important part, and it's a part of also growing up and just learning how to interact with the world. If students don't have what is known as resilience, which is their ability to effectively deal with failure, then they're not going to be very effective when they join the workforce. And they're particularly going to struggle when it comes to things like exams or doing anything that is challenging. So teaching students that failure is a good thing is actually a really good lesson as far as developing students' willingness to be able to have a go. So developing their resilience and their motivation in the face of frustrations and the stresses and anxieties that come with learning anything new. So the first thing I wanted to talk about was reframing. And that basically means that you're changing the way that mental script that happens in their student's sort of mind. So that's called a mental script. And you're thinking about whether, on trying to emphasize the fact that students think about failure as being a positive. So instead of saying, oh, I can't particularly do this, or I'm not very good at maths, so that's the type of mental script that parents and teachers, non-maths teachers and media and things like that reinforce all the time. That negative mental scripting, or that negative mental script, makes it very difficult for the student to motivate themselves to be able to constantly engage and think about and enjoy that particular topic. So if you can change that mental script, which takes time, but it is possible, that's called reframing, and to think about the fact that if you fail something, then that's perfectly okay. So one way we do that is by using examples. And I'm just going to write a couple more up here. And by the mental script, sometimes you can literally give students an actual quote type of thing that they can run through in their mind and say to themselves. So, for example, a lot of students will get 65%. A lot of students, where's my thing? Will get 65% in an exam or a test or whatever, and they'll be absolutely distraught. They'll think, oh, I got 35% wrong. Some students will see the positives, some will see the negatives. So if you can change the way they think about that, so they're constantly reminding themselves, and they can say things like I got the majority correct, and I can easily learn the rest. So I wrote that messily, but I'm trying to get through it quickly. So I got the majority correct, and I can easily learn the rest. Okay, so that's just one sort of example of a way in which you can reframe those negative sort of thoughts into more positive scripts. Obviously, you can use examples. The famous one that you hear all the time, you probably heard a million times, is the whole Thomas Edison failed 1,200 times before he invented the light bulb type of thing. So there's lots of different examples that you can use, even if it comes even if it's using celebrities and not just inventors and those typical sort of ones that you hear all the time, but celebrities is a good one, or famous people, particularly sports people and things along those lines. Obviously, another one I like to add in here, and another way in which you can embed failure into, not so much, you wouldn't actually do an activity about failure, actually you would do, so we're going to go teach failure, but generally you're not actually doing an activity about failure, but what you're actually doing is making it a part of that day-to-day conversation. So you're letting students know that, well, failure is normal. So you're reframing it, mental script, and we're talking about failure being normal. And just having a conversation around it. So how do we do this? I teach adults, and as part of that process, one of the first things I always say is that you're going to have feelings like frustration, you're going to have negative mental scripts, and you're going to say stuff like, why am I even learning this crap? This is a waste of my time. I don't even want to do this anyway. So they're all negative mental scripts. Being able to recognise that failure equals frustration is an important, I guess, emotional skill, an emotional IQ type skill. So I don't even know how we got onto that, but the idea, the next point we were talking about is science. Now, the idea that, sorry, that's what we were talking about, yeah, just adding that to that daily conversation. And a part of that, not just in a science class, but as part of that, and similar to the one above it, is the idea that a lot of things that we do today is, from a scientific point of view, or entire industries, is based on failure. So science, as an actual topic, is based on failure, right? So it's based on we try it, it fails, we try it, it fails, we try it, it fails. So again, having that conversation with students and changing the way they think about failure as not always being negative, and it's about being normal. So failure is just a normal part of the process, whether you're learning to read, whether you're doing some type of course as an adult, whether you're reading something, whether you're trying to learn new bits of information and recall it, whether you're trying to learn how to do a particular sport or a new skill or whatever it is, failure is completely and utterly normal. So you're going through that process of normalizing it in the actual classroom. And when it does happen, there's a good chance you're going to experience some type of frustration and those feelings of frustration. Then you can have that conversation about how to deal with it, because quite often what happens when students experience frustration is that they do this. They have a meltdown. The other thing that they do is called this. If they don't have a meltdown, they do what is known as off-task behaviour, or they do task avoidance behaviours. AVOIDANCE, task avoidance behaviour. I've done videos on all of these. This is basic behaviour management 101, right? So if students are feeling frustrated, they're going to, particularly if they've got a disability or a disorder, they'll have a meltdown. So that's the tantrum, that's running away, that kind of stuff, trying to just somehow get out of or communicate that they're not happy with that situation. For students who don't have disabilities or disorders, because the meltdown is normally associated with autism, for students who don't have a disability or disorder, for the neurotypical or non-disabled, as they say, or students without a disability, I can't remember the term, off-task behaviour, chatting to a friend, so on and so forth is really common, and task avoidance. So that's it's two slightly different behaviours. Task avoidance, and another one actually, is escape motivated. So escape motivated behaviours. So that's what causes that. In a way, these are all escape motivated behaviours. But when we talk about that, we talk about the student who's, say, baiting the teacher or whatever to get kicked out of class. That's what we generally mean by escape motivated behaviour, as well as the meltdown. So they're trying to find ways to get out of class. So the actual root cause of their behaviour is those feelings of frustration. Now, bear in mind, I always like to remind people that it's so easy for us as adults to expect so much of students because, they're kids, they do that all day, yada, yada, yada. But how often do you feel frustrated when you have to learn something new. So when you go to the shops and you're trying to learn where certain items are located in the shop and you can't find this certain whatever so you can bake a cake or something, how frustrating is that, walking up and down the aisles all day? So in that sense, putting together a piece of furniture is the classic example that I always use. You get a present for some reason and it's got instructions, or it could be a model ship or something, and you're trying to put it together and you think that a part is missing, or the instructions aren't written carefully or properly or whatever. You get really frustrated real quick. Yet we expect kids to be able to do things and to be super motivated and to do it all day, every single day. So I just want you to bear in mind that different perspective there, and what happens when we feel frustration, or experience failure, and then that breeds habit, because what happens is students quickly learn that feelings of failure. The other thing that comes from failure, and the reason why these become habit too, is because of that loss of face. So, which basically is a term that means students are really worried about being publicly humiliated in front of their peers. So they don't want to be seen as a failure. So they go through a process of trying to avoid any type of failure or any type of perceived failure or potential failure. So then they go and do stuff like kick chairs and swear at a teacher or whatever. Anyway, so that's why using those examples and trying to normalise failure is a really good way of trying to prevent this, and having those mental scripts so students go, oh yeah, that's that feeling of frustration right now, but I do remember it will pass. I remember having this conversation, and I've been through this 20 or 30 times. I'm feeling frustrated because I don't know what I'm doing. I'm thinking, why do I even have to do this? This is horrible. This teacher's an idiot. This person does this course is crap. This blah, blah, blah. But once I figure it out, then suddenly I'll enjoy it. It'll be my favourite subject again. Now, there's other different things that we can teach students how to deal with this, and sometimes it's just simple things like being able to use teaching strategies, which is another one. Now that includes, for example, processes or process. I'm going to call it process learning. I think that's an AI type term, but I'm going to call it process learning. And that means you're dividing, it's a type of metacognitive skill, dividing a particular task into various different sections and targeting and specifically thinking about what you're good at and what you're not good at. If there's 5 steps, the student narrows it down and goes, well, I can do 1, 2, 3, and 4. It's only number 5 I can't do, so I can actually do 80%. Again, you're reframing how they're thinking about their failure. Another one is chunking. Obviously, where that again is a different type. So process learning is where you've sort of got that iterative or evolving steps that one leads into another, what is called elaborate learning or elaboration, sorry. Chunking is different, is where you divide it into unique different sections. So anyway, there's a bit of an overlap there. Any of those different teaching strategies, particularly metacognitive skills and coping strategies. So I've got videos on these, so feel free to watch those. They're also very useful in teaching students how to deal with failure. Now, we can also teach failure, and this is a really important thing that we do with students with autism and disabilities and students who have anger management problems and stuff like that. Sometimes we use social stories to do it, and sometimes we also just set students up for failure. So set students up for failure. And we do that by saying, in this particular game, you're going to lose. You can't win. I'm not going to let you win. I've set up the rules so that you can't actually win, because I want these students over here to win today. So that's only fair. So you're learning how to fail. And you're using that word. I would use that word. Of course, if you are going to tell students that they are going to fail, you've got to be really careful around how you do that. Telling students that they are failures is a bit of a risk, I guess. So using any of these types of techniques and that type of terminology, I'd just be really careful about it. If it's your first week in a school, I probably wouldn't be going near this too soon. If you've been in a school for a few years and you feel like you've mastered your job type of thing, you're pretty good at the other 50 or so teaching strategies that I talk about, or 100 or so teaching strategies. You've got the behaviour management stuff down pat, there's another 100 odd of them, then maybe this is one of the strategies you can concentrate on. I really wouldn't consider this to be an advanced strategy. but it's definitely not the one you would do on day one when you've just finished your course the day before type of thing. In other words, just be really, really careful with it. That's my little disclaimer there. Okay, so another way to teach failure, as I was saying, was to set students up for failure. And then I think the example we were using is playing a ball game or whatever. And then at the end of that, you would then call the student back and reward them for being a good sport, or for not having that meltdown, or for congratulating the other students and having that mental discussion about how failure, yes, you failed, but that's okay. There's nothing wrong with that. That's just a normal part of playing a game. And just one other quick thing. I heard probably, I don't know, 12 months ago, someone talking about, talking about this strategy in a slightly different way on the radio. And she was talking about how kids fail at playing video games all the time. And that really got me thinking, because when kids do play video games, one, they're choosing to do it. They're not being forced to play video games. They're doing it in their own spare time. They're doing it for hours on end. They're getting addicted to it. They absolutely love doing it. They do it with their friends. They do it on their own. And in fact, they won't... They'd prefer to do that for 15 hours on a Saturday than to do anything else. Sometimes it becomes a bit of an addiction, I guess, doesn't it? So I always like to think about this particular strategy and those instances where students naturally are happy to go and fail on their own repetitively in front of their peers, and how that sort of happens and what happens there and how we can use that in the classroom environment. So in that case, it's interesting to think about why students enjoy playing video games so much, even though really what they're doing is failing over and over again. Fail, try again, fail, try again, try, over and over again. So in that sense, they are actually learning by failure. So it does happen. That can be, I guess, a really good example here. And there are various different reasons for that. So obviously playing video games is presented in a way that's fun. It taps into their sort of the lizard part of the brain, whether it's learning to hunt or whatever. So there's various different reasons for why video games are actually really popular and addictive in that sense. But anyway, it's an interesting, I guess, analogy to think about. If students are really motivated to do this at home, what aspects of that can we use to motivate them in the classroom? And because they are already failing, they might play a video game all weekend and fail 1,000 times in front of and be happy to do it in front of all their friends and not have a meltdown. So, how can we use that in the maths classroom or whatnot? So I think that also says something about games and playing games with kids, which is another video that I've done that I guess it doesn't really... I guess it does relate to failure, actually, because that would be a perfect way to start talking about that before moving on to talking about failure in maths and science and all those other things. Okay, so lovely spelling mistake, which I make all the time. Okay, so there's the basics, the basic 4 or 5. I've just got a few other ones to go through. That one there, design activities. 1 second. Yeah, that should probably do. Okay, so we've got this bit here, that teaching failure. I just wanted to add in a little point there about designing activities. So you're teaching it. Obviously, this whole thing is about teaching it. But what I probably should have done is called it designing activities. Okay, which lead to natural failure. So you will fail type of thing. And then use that as a way to build resilience and to normalise the idea that failure is just a normal part of a lot of different, a normal part of learning and a normal part of life. Now, 2 other ones I really wanted to talk about. There's another thing called, a popular sort of term called strength-based practice. Strength-based practice, which I wrote very messily there. Strength-based practice has come from the disability sector. It's a bit of a buzzword at the moment, but it basically means concentrating on what people can do as opposed to concentrating on what they can't do. Now, this kind of concentrates on what they can't do in a sense, But then when you think about it, no, not really, because over here we're looking at, when we're doing the process learning, we're dividing up and looking at, well, you can do these 7 different things. It's only this one aspect here that you can't actually do. So let's concentrate on that. Then you take number 7 and you further divide that up into bits anyway. So what do we know, what don't we know? And then it turns out that they know, that they know, that they know. So I call that process learning, but as part, bear that in mind as a, I guess it's a separate, I don't think I'd call strength-based practice an actual teaching strategy per se. It's more of a, I guess, a theory. It's more of a concept to just be aware of, and you might come across that now and then. And the other one I wanted to talk about is this, I guess it's another cognitive skill or another coping mechanism, and that's more of teaching, that's more so about teaching not just strategies, but other metacognitive skills and coping strategies, so they kind of relate there. But I like to have this one as a separate strategy because I think it's really important as a part of that process, and that's for students to be conscious of failure, but to also figure out how they could minimise the chances of failure. So in this case, it might be that if they're sitting an exam, for example, or a test, or doing any type of activity in class, then they're actually going through that process and working out what they're good at and what they're not good at as a part of the preparation process. So one way to minimise that is self-assessment. So again, self-assessment is all about failure. Reviews, self-reviews, that's not really a word. Self-assessment is all about reviewing and what you know, what you don't know, being able to divide a topic or an activity into various different aspects and trying to figure out, again, what you can do, what you can't do, and going about continually narrowing down the chances of failure. So if there are 7 different sections, they're narrowing down, okay, number 1, I can do 80%. Well, let's make sure I get that 100%. Number 2, number 3, number 4, and so on and so forth. So I was going to draw that up there in a slightly different way, but I think that'll be a bit of a waste of time. So that whole self-assessment process, which is also known as self-questioning, slightly different, but pretty much the same. Reflective practice is another one that teachers and professionals do, but I think it's a really important strategy for students to do and to learn how to do as well. So that's basically what I got to say about the learning by failure as an actual strategy. Again, just be a little bit careful with it. And there's probably one other one which I'm just going to squeeze in somewhere. And what am I going to call that one? Tell students, no, I won't call it that. I can't remember what I called it in my blog, in my book. I'm going to call it, or even if I put it in there, recognise and admit failure. So I'm going to call that recognise and admit failure. It's not number 2, it just kind of goes in there. None of these are in a particular order. And the idea of that is that students aren't avoiding the fact that they're going to fail. So they're planning for it, they're preparing for it, they know they're going to fail. That's a part of that reframing conversation. Failure is inevitable, but it's not a bad thing. And then when it does happen, they're recognising it, they're admitting it, because then they can go about trying to figure out how to fill those gaps if there are problems in what they're doing, particularly if you're doing any of those mastery learning or overlearning type things where you want students to get really, really, really good at something in particular, then they need to figure out what is going wrong. And a part of that is being able to articulate that they are a failure. Now, this is the bit where you have to be really careful, because the last thing you want is a parent complaint and be dragged in front of some tribunal or something. But I think there's something to be said about at least thinking of the idea of being more clear with students that they identify and can say to themselves, oh, I got that wrong, or I failed at that particular bit. So you can, I guess I would, again, be very careful there, and depending on your relationship with the students and their age particularly, and so on and so forth, but at least recognising it and verbally admitting. So having that conversation. You didn't get this bit right. You got it completely wrong. Great. Now we know what you can and cannot do. Now we know we can concentrate on this particular section. So I'm just going to call that the recognition aspect of learning by failure. So that's that particular strategy. use it very wisely and very carefully, and start having those conversations with students and teaching them those resiliency type skills, so that they are going to keep coming back and keep trying, and their motivation will be high enough, their self-esteem will be high enough, and they'll have that emotional IQ and those mental scripts to be able to recognise when failure, frustration happens, and then try again, and have the strategies to be able to go through that process on their own as part of a coping strategy or a metacognitive strategy. That's learning by failure.